We already talked about the distinction between a regional issue versus a local issue. And if there is a regional issue and it's something that neither party could have anticipated, then the person who had rented real estate is not held liable for the inability to be able to work the land. Um, says, let's see. Let's just review this. He says, Umnam. So he says, um, Ume'ata yesh ladun mahadin besocher. That we're just reviewing a little bit. What will be the din when you hire a worker to do work for you, and then some mishap of a regional nature occurs? Do you have to pay him for his labor? V'hineim nomar sheschiras poal imdina keschiras karka. Is as if we're going to say that hiring a worker is no different from renting a property. Kishem shebischiras karka hasocher pater milashalim. When there's a regional blight, just like a renter is exempt from paying the rent. Kach bischiras poalim hasocher pater milashalim. We should say the same thing when it comes to hiring workers. To the point where even if you hired him, even if you paid for the employee would have to pay you back. Ach, gam im nechalek ben schiras karka leschiras poilim v'nomer shedin makas medina hu rak beschiras karka v'lo beschiras poilim. And if you're going to say the cases are different, that there's an inherent difference conceptually between renting land and paying for workers, im kain beschiras poilim in chiluk ben makas medina lo inas rogel eladina kecholones. Well, then we would revert back to labor law, which basically said that in any situation where neither the employer nor the employee could have anticipated this occurring, then the contract is null and void. The kevin sheshneim lo yadu me'ona zeb seder depol hu vein sarach l'shalom oschara. So that's what we saw yesterday. No matter how you slice it, it would seem that in a coronavirus scenario, if I put a down payment on a venue, or if I hired workers, even if I paid them already, they would have to return the money to me. That's what we saw yesterday. And then we threw a wrench in it. Amnam b'darchei Moshe hevius divrei Mordechai, in the name of the Maharam, v'inyan malamed sheyef shelo lilmod mipnei gzeras hamoshel. But what happens in a case where a ruler rules that Torah teachers can no longer teach? Okay, upasak sham dahavimakas medina v'chola hefsed ala balabayis. And surprisingly, he says that this is called a regional blight, but that the parent, the employer, has to pay. V'hiksha harama maishna mehachoker sada v'achla chagav demakas medina hu menakalo men chakiro. And the Rama asks, why is this any different from when you rent a field and a regional blight occurs and you cannot use the field, so that the renter is exempt from paying? V'tirates the dafka bekarka shadayin omedes becheskas hamaskir amrinan degam hu yafsid. And we said that that's different. He says, because when when a person owns a piece of property and he rents it out, we say that the title remains in the name of the owner of the property. And therefore, the owner of the property has to assume that loss. Masha'enkein bishar maskir, ulakach kol hahefsed shel hasocher. But when I rent an employee, we don't say that the onus is on the owner of the employee, meaning the employee, but rather we say that the renter of the employee or the employer has to pay. It's different because there's no retention, let's say, of ownership on the employee, which is a strange argument. Yeah, and he says, and that's what it seems from others. So it seems like we're throwing a wrench in labor law, and we're basically, according to this, it seems quite contrary to what we've just learned up until now. That in labor law we saw that when the mishap could not have been anticipated by either party, the contract is null and void. and the employer owes nothing. Here we're saying just the opposite, that the employer has to pay for the Torah tutor who cannot work. So the Ramah says, "V'chein pasuk maharam al malamed shegozer hamosher shalol yilmod, the havimakas medina v'chol hefsed hala balabais," and the Ramah says that explicitly. V'chein remez lazeh b'simin shin lamedal v'zel shano. V'chein b'chol oina she'ira lepoyel bein sheshneim hayodim shederach haones lavo shneim einam yodim habipseda the poyel. And the Ramah writes in Shin Lamedalad, which is all about labor law, he says if neither party could have anticipated the mishap, the employee has to absorb the loss. Aval, however, in balabayas yodeya v'hapol eini yodeya habipseda the balabayas, and if the balabayas could have anticipated this mishap and the employee could not, then the employer has to pay. And then he finally says, "V'im havi makas medina ayin le'el simin shin chaf aleph." And if it's a regional blight that prevents the worker from working, I refer you to what we previously said. And what he's referring to is that with a regional mishap, then the employer has to pay. And that's like, there's no rhyme or reason why that should be. Why, when there's a regional plague, does the employer have to pay? He couldn't have anticipated that. Why should that make any difference? So that's what Rav Shirag is getting to. I hope that you don't mind us going a little bit deeper down this rabbit hole, because it really is getting complex, but it's worth, I think, examining this
Alice
issue.
said it's getting curiouser and curiouser.
Yeah, that's right. Ulam dvarim elo shekasav harama b'shem maharam timu and ma'od. He says, but they don't make any sense, says Rav Shraga. V'chemoshe ikshu hasma v'hagrav and hasivas v'achikre leivshar b'skiris polim ba'onis ragel shinamakas medina v'lo haviluhu lamed upseda the poilhu. He says, because in any other situation where an employee cannot fulfill his work, and it's not something that either party could have anticipated, we say that the contract is void and the employer has no liability. Umakas Medina, and therefore a regional plague would be the perfect reason to exempt an employer from having to pay. And that's the case of renting a field. Also, when you rent a field and there's a regional blight, then the person who's renting, which is like the employer, doesn't have to pay. V'makas Medina hi menakalo. V'uadin b'schiris Poland. Makas Medina hi si belifter esasocher v'lo l'chayvo. Ve'echivo maharam mipnei shemakas Medina. So this makes absolutely no sense. It runs completely contrary to everything that we've learned. V'chein bagos ashri hevi din zevitamolav. And the Hagos Ashri also questions this. He says, "V'mabitul machmas gezeres amoshel be'ir v'yefshel lamalamdim lilmod havilei makas medina v'nosin l'kol schara v'tzarchim l'kamen ba'amakabel ankan." And he quotes it in the case of the tutor that can't teach because the ruler has made an edict that there's not any more Jewish education. The balabayas, the parent of the child, still has to pay the tutor. He says, I don't understand why that should be. Okay, we're going to skip to the end of the paragraph. Because of hasma shemistimas hator v'shulchan aruch mavur shebeschiras polim ein chiluk bein ones ragil l'makas medina v'tamid pseda the poli. And therefore the Sma, contrary to the Ramah, writes that if there's a regional plague, it makes no difference whether it's a regional plague or a regular mishap. When it comes to labor law, the employee cannot sue the employer. The employer has no liability, and it's the employee's loss. Uvedas maram kosav asmadi ishlomer shein kavanaso shia kol hefsed ala balabayis v'shom l'pol kol scharo, and he tries to explain the Maharam, which is quoted by the Ramah, and he says it doesn't mean that the entire burden is upon the employer. Ela dekaven shemakas medina he hefsed al shneim. But rather with the regional plague, they both lose. Umasha kosav harama b'shem maram shkol hefsed al balabayis b'mordechai lo kosav shkol hefsed al balabayis elahe v'yehe hefsed shel balabayis v'aynu shi hefsed al shneim v'yachloku ayin sham. He says perhaps all the Maharam means is that the employer has to pay half because they have to split the loss. That's a third position, right? Basically, it's it's no one's fault since it's no one's fault, let's split the difference. But the SMA himself doesn't agree with that. The SMA himself says that the contract is null and void, and therefore the employer is not on the hook for anything. V'hashach v'hataz dachu es dvarav shri bagosa shri hevi din zev v'kosav leheja ima bitul machmas gezeres hamoshel be'ir v'yev shod melamdin lilmod habalei makas medina benosin lokol scharo. And that's what the SMA writes, that maybe that's what the Maharam means to split the loss. The Shach and the Taz simply don't agree with that, because if you look at the language of how the Maharam is quoted, they all quote him as saying that the employer assumes the full responsibility, not half. V'hanasivas kasav v'das Maharam shelo kasav kein ela b'malame kevin shaslo litos char limit ela rak schar shimor. So the Nesivas has his own solution. And he says, you know what the solution to the problem is? Who is liable? He says it's only in a unique case of a Torah teacher. Okay, a Torah teacher is not taking wages for his teaching Torah. You know how we know this? Because you're not allowed to take money for doing a mitzvah. You're not allowed to take money for teaching Torah. When you hire a Torah teacher, what are you paying him for? No, right. The lost time. In other words, you're just paying him for his time, that he could be doing something else during that time. You're not paying him for the actual work product that he is outputting. And therefore, ugzeres hamoshel eino ones al hashim or rak al halimud. And so the monarch's decree, no more Torah teaching, does not prevent you from paying him for his time.
Does the rabbi apply the same for a rabbi?
Could be. I don't know. Maybe I'm not teaching Torah. V'lochein balabayis chayev l'shalim lo scharo kevin shegam la'achik zeres hamoshel hu yochol l'shamer et hayeled ayin sham. So therefore, a Torah teacher, in other words, what are you paying a Torah teacher for when he's a private tutor? You're paying him for babysitting. You're not paying him for what he's actually educating.
Yeah.
Okay, so that was not under the regional edict preventing this guy from teaching. So I can still be your kid's babysitter, and you have to pay me for that. So therefore, that's the reason the Nesiva says only in that case, but in regular labor law, the employer would be off the hook.
If the tutor was teaching secular studies, it would be different.
What do you mean it would be different? He wouldn't be under the edict of the monarch.
Oh, no, but
The monarch
it was
makes
COVID in the secular.
right.
teacher
If
couldn't
in a
teach.
case of COVID, right. In a case of COVID, you would hold the employer, the parent, right, to be completely off the hook.
Right.
But let's see. Ulefize gam ledas maharam bishar polin gam b'makas medina menakalo mischaro. He says exactly what you suggested, Paul. According to that, with all other kinds of workers, when there's a regional plague, then you don't have to pay him. So that's one solution to the problem. The Chinuch Beis Yehuda also acknowledges that when there's a regional plague, the employer is completely off the hook. Umasha kosav maram shefsad al balabayas yeshlomer dairi b'malame shesocher so balabayas lizman yadua vehechilu al shulchano benasan lo escharo koloso zman. And the Maharam, who says that the balabayas, the father of the child, has to pay the tutor, that's talking about a unique situation where the father hired this fellow, brought him in from out of town, gave him a place to live, and gave him his full wages. And then after paying him, when discovering that the tutor can't pay, he said, give me back the money. And the reason why the employer is not entitled to a refund in that case is because the tutor continued to live with him the entire time of the plague. And because of that, that was a demonstration that the employer was really moichel on the wages. He basically, see, he hires him for a year, brings him from out of town. 3 months into the annual contract, the edict comes out or the plague comes out, and the teacher can no longer teach. But he says, stay, you might as well stay. You've come for the year, you might as well stay. So by allowing him to stay in his house during the edict, that demonstrates that he was Michael. And that's why he's not allowed to ask the tutor for the money back. However, that's a stretch in the language of the Maharam, but you see that everyone's trying to figure out a solution to this Maharam because it's completely inconsistent with the rest of the labor laws that we've seen so far. Now, let's take a look at the Chochma Shlomo, at the Maharshal. So he says, Uva Chochma Shlomo, Kasav de Maharam Mayri Kishahisa Hagzer ala Talmidim Shal Yilmedu. He writes, he has another solution to the problem. He says, you know the reason why the Balabayas, the father, still has to pay the tutor? Because the edict of the monarch was that children may no longer study Torah. So the argument that he gives is, there was no edict on the teachers, there was an edict on the students. Students may no longer learn Torah. So that doesn't stop me from teaching. Okay, so that's his way.
Stand on the street corner
That's his solution. In other words, the king's edict does not apply to me. You still have to pay me because the king's edict does not prohibit me from teaching. It just prohibits your child from learning. But you hired me. You didn't hire your child. And so therefore you still have to pay me. But if the edict would be on teachers, so then the father would not have to pay. Because again, he could say, I only have to pay you if you can fulfill your work contract. If you can't fulfill your work contract, and it's not something that we could have anticipated, I'm off the hook. That the Ramah now is consistent because the Ramah writes that if the employee cannot do his work anymore because there's been a change in the air quality, let's say, then it's no different from any other mishap, and the employee is not entitled to compensation. And the question is, well, that's a regional plague. If we can't work because the air is not breathable and we have to evacuate the area, how is that different from a regional plague? And didn't the Ramah write that when there's a regional plague, the employer is on the hook? The Tiretz HaChachma Shlomo the Dafka B'Gzeras HaMoshel She'Gzera Al HaTalmidim Tzarech L'Shalim LaMalamed. And the Maharshal answers, the Chachma Shlomo answers. He says, it's only when it's a monarchical edict that is only on the students that the contract still is binding on the employee, and therefore you have to pay him. But if there's a change in air quality, so both teacher and student have to evacuate the area and he can't teach them anymore, that's like any other kind of breach, or not a breach, a nullification of the work contract, and therefore the employer is off the hook. And the Chachma Shlomo basically writes, that's really the bottom line, is that whenever there's a regional preclusion from working, the employer is completely off the hook. Uve and now he continues going through this again. I'm not sure if I want to do the rest of the tshuva in all of its text. So we're going to go to the next packet. Wow, we're really going to town on this one, huh? Okay, so this is quite lengthy. Just give me 1 second, please, and we're going to bring up the next packet. Yeah,
What I don't understand is that throughout our history, which has been a difficult to ask for history, I'm sure there have been many edicts where, you cannot teach your kids, you can't learn Torah, you can't. There's stories of being afraid to read the Torah, things like that. Isn't that a category all by itself? In terms of, where I'm sure the communities, the Zucchini, the smart people that are trying to keep Judaism alive would say, under all circumstances, they have to learn Torah. So that the edicts, they're trying to fit the edict of the monarch about Torah teaching into, generalized labor laws. And it seems, I would have thought that they would be less concerned about what the monarch has to say and say, we're gonna teach and we're gonna teach, we're gonna pay, we're gonna continue that whole process, no matter what.
yeah, it could be that Torah education, you're saying, is a unique scenario, not because of the argument of it's on the students, but not on the teacher, but rather this is kihem chayenu. This is our life, and no matter what, we have to figure out a way to pay our teachers. Otherwise, it could result in a complete breakdown in Torah education and in Judaism. Okay. So, okay. Now let's go to this. Let's see how much more we have of this. Halacha l'maisa. Okay. Okay, halacha l'maisa. I don't know why I'm experiencing this thing on my screen. I'm going to stop the share for just a moment. And then I'm going to expand this. And then I'm going to go back and I'm going to share my screen once more. And here we go. L'maisa. So the final halacha is gananos umetaplos sheneeltzu liskor et haganim ekev magefas hakorona v'hora'as harishuyos. He says, if the daycare centers were forced to close their schools because of corona and because of the governmental rules, min hadin ein hahorim chayavim l'shalim al hazman sha'agan hayas sagur. Then halachically, based on everything that we've seen so far, the parents are not obligated to pay for the time when the gan was closed. So basically, it's just like when there's a regional plague, there's no obligation. Right. Okay. Aval, al yemei hachovsha shebahem, halav hachi hagan haya amor liot sagur, hahorim chayavim l'shalim et mulo hatashlum. But let's say for the time down, that even if the gan was closed, the parents would have to pay. In other words, let's say there's vacation time. And let's say, in other words, I pay a monthly fee to the gan, but let's say on vacation days, she's also compensated. So whatever I would have normally compensated my employees for sick days, vacation leave, and things like that, I would still have to pay them, because it's not that the work contract is completely nullified. It's just that you're not obligated to pay for the work that can't be done. But for that time period where there is a ganenet, a daycare center is compensated for days off, that you have to still pay. V'im hahorim shilmu meirosh, yefshar l'chayv et haganenet lahachzir lehem et hatashlum shekibla. If the parents already paid, you cannot obligate the daycare center to give back the money. Why? Because she can always say, I rely on the Rama, who says that when there's a regional plague, the Rama says, he goes like the Maharam, who suggests that the Balabayas has to pay. Aval ha'orim yicholim lekazeis tashlum zeh v'yemei hachofsha magim leganenet b'chodesh Nisan. But let's say, in other words, during the month of Nisan, you're basically paying for the whole year. But let's say they say it's 10,000 shekels for the year. I don't know what it costs for a daycare center. Well, let's say it's 10,000 shekels for the year, and that includes the entire month of Nisan when they give off to the daycare center. So you still have to pay her for the month of Nisan because she would have been off anyway. But let's say you paid, you already made payments, and you're all paid up, even though for this month you paid up, and now they closed the daycare. You can deduct that from what you would have had to pay her for the month of Nisan. And whatever she already received for her inability to work in the month of Adar will offset what you would have had to pay her in the month of Nisan. So that's the bottom line.
Well, Rabbi, if you had a yearly contract with somebody, a daycare center, where you paid them 10,000 shekels for that yearly, and you paid it up front, you would be aware of the day, for instance, the days they're not going to be open would be I mean, you'd know it. So it would be part of the understanding that you weren't paying for those days. So the $10,000.
It depends.
10,000 shekels.
The argument that he's making is, let's say I have to pay every month. The daycare fees are due at the first of every month.
Okay.
And including the 1 month that I don't work.
But you know that your yearly amount has been divided by 10 or 12, whatever the months are, right? So you know when you go into their contract that those days are going to be holidays. It's not like
You do.
It's not like it's something you didn't plan.
You do know, but the agreement is to pay. The way that he's interpreting the work contract is not that you're paying only for the work product. You're paying for a year's salary for a teacher, whether she works or not. And you will know when she's going to be working, when she's not going to be working, and you're already in advance agreeing to pay her for the month of Nisan when her work will be minimal.
When you know that she's going to only work so many days.
That's
out of the
right.
month.
That's right.
Right.
And so therefore, and it's the same amount. So his argument is you'd have to pay her for that month when you knew she was not working anyway, because implicit in the agreement was, I'm paying you a salary for Nisan, even though you're only going to be teaching my kid for 3 days.
So if you had a regional declaration that said that they couldn't go to work for that month,
Yeah.
what we're saying here is that you still have to pay for the month, even though you knew, right? Because there were certain days in that month that they weren't going to work. So
That's right.
It stays there.
That's right. You're agreeing to give them money, not for labor or not for work product, but you're agreeing to give them money just because it's part of the package. And so that is his conclusion. Okay. All right. So we'll hold it here for today. Tomorrow's tshuva is about a person who goes into a restaurant knowing that he has the virus and ends up infecting other people.
How many pages is that?
There's a real life situation.
Yeah, okay.